The Hunter Biden laptop scandal claims its first scalp. I'm Scott Ott, and this episode of Bill Whittle Now is brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. And Bill, that scalp is born atop Glenn Greenwald, the reporter for the Intercept, who announced his resignation from that publication, which, by the way, he helped to co-found a few years back as a bulwark against censorship by editors over reporters. Greenwald quit from the Intercept because the editors at the Intercept asked him to revise a story that he had written about the Hunter Biden laptop, hard drive, and emails and the connection with the corruption possibilities with presidential candidate Joe Biden. And more specifically, the story was about how the mainstream media, in cahoots with Silicon Valley, has essentially put a lid on that story and refused to cover it. In any case, the editors asked him to dial it back and make it a much narrower story, which was basically about how reporters are not willing to ask the Biden campaign the tough questions, but felt that Greenwald didn't prove his case on the larger story. And Greenwald said, your evidence is scanty and I quit. Bill, I don't know how up to date you are on this story. I've read a lot about it and there's a lot to it. But I think it's interesting, for starters, that Glenn Greenwald isn't some right-wing nut job. In fact, Glenn Greenwald lives in Brazil, where he's married to a man, and that man is a socialist congressman in Brazil. Does it surprise you that the first sort of domino to fall in the Biden scandal comes from that side of the aisle?
This is actually an interesting story for a lot of reasons. And the first thing I want to say about this is, no, I disagree with Glenn Greenwald about a lot of things. He's not a right-wing nut job. He's a left-wing nut job. And he's a left-wing nut job with integrity and character and some sort of moral compass. And these are the kind of people I want to have as my countrymen, generally speaking. People who I can disagree with about things, but people who have a fundamental moral core and a set of immovable values. I respect people who have immovable values in almost any case, no matter what those values may be. But for a guy like this to make this statement is an indication that there are still a few people left in the business who have some sense of journalistic integrity. I'll tell you this, though, after this election is over, one way or another, the term journalist is going to be held in even lower regard than it is now. And frankly, I think the term's going to become obsolete.
Now, under Glenn Greenwald's contract, and he's pursuing the breakup now through his attorneys, but under his contract, if the publication or the website, rather, the Intercept, were ever to refuse to publish one of his pieces, he's free to publish that elsewhere. And he has already done so. And so the story gets out. But it's interesting. This was from the lead of Greenwald's original story. He describes a de facto union of media outlets, Silicon Valley giants, and the intelligence community that have sought to suppress the Biden story, the Biden laptop story. Bill, you've talked about this before, and so I have no question about where you stand on it. But one of the editors at The Intercept, Peter Maas, or Maas, M-A-A-S, said that the core problem in the draft of Greenwald's story was the connection that it often asserts or assumes between the Hunter Biden emails and corruption by Joe Biden. He says things like, phrases like the big guy are too vague and don't prove the case. Greenwald, for his part, says he went overboard to state that that didn't prove the case, but that shouldn't keep that out of the story as a point of discussion, and certainly doesn't explain why the mainstream media and the big social media giants have sought to squelch the story.
Given Hunter Biden's extensive connections to high-level operators like himself, the hundreds of people that he works with who are just top-quality people who are constantly moving around and doing all kinds of wonderful things, I can see why there might be some confusion about who the big guy might be in Hunter Biden's life. You never know. It could be maybe the tallest of his cocaine dealers. But I rather suspect that the big guy in question is Joe Biden. And I think that is a not unreasonable assumption. Now, when you mentioned that this is a three-way collusion between big media, big tech, and big government.
And that's actually the intelligence community he was mentioning. And I'll tell you why.
That's what I meant to say.
Because there was a release of a letter that came from former intelligence officers who were suggesting that this was some sort of Russian disinformation, and in any case couldn't be proven. And but in that letter, they actually said that they couldn't prove their case either.
The director of national intelligence said that he saw no evidence whatsoever that this was Russian disinformation. But let's put that aside. You've got big media, you've got big tech, and you've got the intelligence community. Big media is guilty of criminal negligence. Big tech is guilty of obstruction and fraud. And the intelligence community is guilty of treason. And those are serious charges.
Another editor at the Intercept, Betsy Reed, said that the parting of ways between the publication and Glenn Greenwald came because of a fundamental, and I'm quoting, a fundamental disagreement over the role of editors in the production of journalism and of the nature of censorship. Peter Mass, one of the other editors I mentioned earlier, said maybe the reason why the mainstream media hasn't done more stories about it is because only 2 outlets are in possession of the contents of the hard drive from Hunter Biden's, or alleged Hunter Biden's laptop, and that is the New York Post and the Wall Street Journal. And so because they don't have access to the information, therefore they can't really write the stories definitively. What do you make of that accusation? Because that seems to be true as far as we know. Maybe they haven't really been sitting on the story. They just don't have the story.
Well, first of all, that's to suggest that the New York Times is essentially a blog with no, just as an example of all of the major news outlets that have declined to cover this story. That's to suggest that they're just mom and pop organizations. Well, we didn't get the documents, so how can we possibly report on it? It's not like we have anybody who could go out and look into these things for themselves or ask questions on their own. So I don't buy that argument. And the real difference is not between Greenwald and the editors in terms of selecting which story is true. The real split came over Greenwald having a disagreement with his editors over which stories could be spiked, smothered, suppressed, and covered over. That's the job of editors today. They have multiple layers of fact checkers and editors to make sure that the truth does not accidentally leak out if it's going to be harmful to the progressive cause. And one way or another, with the election just a day off, basically, one way or another, the Hunter Biden laptop story will be the defining moment in terms of the last of journalism as we understand, or as we understood the term. Even if they win the election, which I don't think is going to happen, but even if they do, this is all the evidence needed to confirm not only what we already knew, but to confirm that what we already knew is serious enough to steal an election. And I use that term with complete confidence. If big tech and news media outlets are sitting on a story after the rumors they ran with regarding impeachment and all the rest, I'm not even going to get into that. But if they've decided to basically sit on this story until after the election, then the election has been stolen. It's been stolen because the people look to these agencies to provide them with the news. That's a historical habit. There's certainly no evidence that they provide the news today, but for many people, for a lot of their lives, these places like the New York Times and CNN and CBS News had some credibility. And if they refuse to cover the story, especially after their standards for covering any story that has to do negatively with Donald Trump, then they have, in fact, stolen the election. And they have shown us that the combination of big media, big tech, and especially the United States of America's intelligence agency operatives are capable of performing a coup. And
Bill, do you think there'll be a reckoning for journalists after the election, even if it turns out that Joe Biden was not the so-called big guy, that was Mayor McCheese or somebody else? If it turns out that the story that seems to be implied from Hunter Biden's laptop contents isn't corruption at the highest levels, do you think journalists have still screwed this up, or do you think that they were fair in the way they handled it?
First of all, let me say that if it's not Joe Biden, I think Mayor McCheese is as likely a candidate as anybody else you might mention. So I don't really even think there's much dispute about that. But yes, they're done. Now, if the way to, I think we fall into a trap of thinking of the country as divided 50-50, but it's not. It's divided into thirds. 33 and a third percent, third, a third, a third. There's the blue third, there's the red third, and then there's the purple third in the middle. There's 100 million Americans who know that the news media is nothing but a collection, as it is known today, mainstream news media, CNN and all the rest, is a collection of partisans who have determined a long time ago, and sometimes state so openly, that the truth is not as important as the big capital T truth, which is the social end goal to which they are striving. And if the suppression of facts gets in the way of that so-called larger truth, then that's just, can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. So a third of the country, the red third of the country, there is no media for the third of the country. We already know that these people are useless. The blue third of the country thinks that everything they say is true, and because the only other people that are reporting it are people like Fox News, they're convinced that Fox News is just inventing stories, and they've been told that by all these other news medias. They're not willing to look at the evidence themselves, not willing to go read the stories themselves. They're not willing to do any of that stuff. They know that CNN tells them, oh, this is just disinformation. Fox News is reporting it, therefore it cannot possibly be true. And they've committed a number of logical errors there, one of which is confusing the message with the messenger. It doesn't matter who delivers the message. The question is the message authentic? And there's a way to determine that. They don't care. So that third is going to continue to think that CNN and MSNBC and all the rest of them are telling them the truth. And those people are, for the foreseeable future, lost to reason. And then, of course, comes the big question, and that's what do you do with the third of the country in the middle that is not particularly political, is not particularly involved with. They don't have a flag planted either in the America's a great hill or on the America's a terrible place hill. They're basically. I don't want to suggest that they're sheep because they're not. They are subject to what they hear, and they have that's not their fault. It's the fault of the corrupt news media. And what we're going to find out on election day, or on election months, election season, we should say probably, as what we'll find out during election season, we will find out whether or not the combination of big tech, big media, and the U.S. intelligence services are enough to throw the election. Because if this information had been broadcast to the same degree as Donald Trump's information, and if they had applied the same restraint to the stories about Donald Trump's corruption that they've been running for 4 years, the whole Steele dossier, I don't need to get into any of that. If they'd applied the same standards of rigor to Trump, then those wouldn't have been stories, and this would be, because this one is hard evidence, and they can look at the evidence. This one is hard evidence. This one is testimony from a principal, listing details, holding receipts. This is actual physical evidence. And for them to not even consider it is an indication that big tech and big media and the intelligence agencies are all the way in. If, on the other hand, we win this election, as I think we will, then this is the end of it for all of them.
Go ahead. I was going to say, in fact, Glenn Greenwald points out in his resignation letter that the editors at the Intercept were at the forefront of promoting the story that the whole Hunter Biden laptop thing was a Russian disinformation campaign. And they ran with the former CIA agent accusation uncritically. And even though everything in that was false, and then Greenwald goes through and just debunks. He does an old-fashioned fisking on the letter that his editors had sent to him about his draft story about this scandal. We will provide links at billwhittle.com with this video so that you can explore that whole chain of emails back and forth. And we'll also provide a link to Greenwald's original story, which eventually got published, but not in the Intercept. Bill, I want to finish up today by quoting two little snippets from what Glenn Greenwald said. I could not sleep at night knowing that I allowed any institution to censor what I want to say and believe. And then he says, Our discourse is becoming increasingly intolerant of dissenting views, and our culture is demanding more and more submission to prevailing orthodoxies imposed by self-anointed monopolists of truth and righteousness, both words capitalized, backed up by armies of online enforcement mobs. Bill, this coming from a gay guy married to a socialist congressman. Is the whole world upside down?
I don't give a damn whether he's gay or not. I don't care who he's married to. I'll agree or disagree with him on the positions he takes based on my own positions. If he makes a compelling enough argument, then I'll become a Marxist socialist as well. The turning me gay parts can take a little more effort, but not dead yet. But what I would like to make crystal clear on this is that this is the kind of person who I welcome as an American citizen and as somebody who has the same nationality as me. We're not supposed to agree on everything. If we all agree on everything, we're going to fall into the same echo chamber there. And these ideas that we believe in should be tested all the time. They should be tested to improve their strength. They should be tested to find out where whatever flaws in reasoning or evidence are, and then either fill those holes or change the theory. But to have somebody with a moral code and somebody who is willing to stand up is somebody that I'm delighted to be part of the same country as. And I hope, although I doubt, that this example might start a cascade. I think that's virtually impossible. But let me just say this. Glenn Greenwald may be the first person, and maybe in the end of it, the only person to have his conscience bother him enough so that he took this kind of action. And he's going to pay for it in terms of his dear, dear friends who will never speak to him again. But it does make you wonder, if it was enough for Glenn Greenwald to resign, are there any shreds of conscience left among the rest of these people? Do they have the slightest misgivings when they go to bed at night? Do they sit there and say, this is wrong, but I'm doing it for the right reason? Anything. Or is this just now simply that's what journalism is now? Journalism is basically telling the truth when it suits you politically, lying when it doesn't, and doing everything in your power to obscure actual evidence and actual truth if it's destructive to your personal political beliefs. That is the job of a state media. That's how Pravda functioned. That's how all of these party organs function. That's how Grandma functions in Cuba. This is what happens in totalitarian regimes. They have a news agency that spits out the party line. There's no independence. If you were to be a member of Pravda, especially in the 30s or 40s or even 50s in Soviet Union, if you were to write something independently critical of the government, first of all, it'd never get published, and you'd never be seen again. And that's what's going to happen, by the way. That's for the end result for all of this stuff. And for these so-called progressives who think that this is going to usher in a new world of freedom and so on, what we found about political correctness, what we found about this idea of free speech, and the number of hundreds of people on the left that have been eaten by the left, any of those journalists out there who say, well, I'm doing this for the right reason, your time is coming. It's not coming from us. We don't care. We've got nothing to do with you anymore. Your own children will eat you alive for being insufficiently ideologically pure and enthusiastic. And this cycle will continue until it stops. And as for the rest of us, win or lose this election, I think the one thing that we can all come out of 2020 with is that 1/3 of the country that's red needs no further prodding to understand that not only do these things need to be broken up, we may or may not have the power to do that. But at the very least, we have to understand that our business with these companies is over. We are no longer going to have anything to do with them. Anything that's reported on CNN to us now, it has been for a while, but now it is not only untrue, it is almost certainly the antithesis of the truth.
The members of BillWhittle.com have made this program possible. You can join them today by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking the big green Become a Member button. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.